Mix up the course structure now and do something you might be a little more familiar with if you're familiar with some of my YouTube style work. We're going to do a hand review where I break down a hand that I played. We're going to get really deep into some answers to the situation and things to think about. A lot to talk about in this hand. I think it's a pretty cool one. We'll go ahead and jump into the action. Our hand begins at 200, 400 heads up, no limit. We're just about 250 big blinds deep. If you guys have watched much of my content online, you'll know I have an open heads up challenge for $100,000 where anyone can come in and we battle it out in the heads up arena. I had a variety of opponents that have taken me up on this. I've had some very good players. I've had some more recreational players. I've had some business guys. I've had some a little bit of everything in this thing. So definitely a fun format if you like heads up no limit or watching heads up no limit content. But anyway, so in this hand, we're playing against Kevin Rabichow, obviously a very strong heads up player. I've played against Kevin several times over the years online, although not as much as some other players you might have imagined, or maybe not as much as you might imagine. And we're about to play a pretty big pot here in our 30% pot flop size. So the action kicks off. I open up 7-4 suited, obviously pure open, and then Kevin goes for the call, maybe a low frequency 3-bet depending on the way he's playing his pre-flop ranges. You know, there's something to be thinking about here with the pre-flop stack sizes because they're constantly shifting, right? Like we start at 250, it can get very deep, it can get more shallow. And so there are multiple ways you can approach the way you want to be 3-betting here pre-flop. The way that I approach it is I kind of play a static 3-betting strategy where I have a strategy where my 3-bets are pretty good as we get deeper, but they also apply for some more shallow. The inside the arena course goes more in depth into what I'm talking about, but just to kind of give you a precursor here. So I play a relatively static 3-betting strategy rounded to quarters. And so the question kind of becomes in the big blind, how do you want to approach your strategy? It's possible Kevin's doing something more complex. It's possible Kevin's doing something similar. It's possible he's doing something more simple. I really don't know. Regardless, King 4 mainly a call. Kevin does decide to call. And we take a flop. King 4-4. Obviously, going to be a pretty cool situation for me. I'm going to lose a good amount of money here. But the question becomes how we're going to play our range. How often do we check back the flop? Let me go ahead and pull up the solution at this point. I ran this one overnight. This is a home-cooked meal, guys. I ran this thing for many hours overnight. Oh, wait, did I stop it? Damn it. I only got down to 0.4. Well, no, it is running. It should have run. I don't know why I stopped at 0.4. Regardless, this should be run down to a pretty unexploitable level. Okay, so let's start off with the flop bet. Kevin checks. I guess the first question is how often do we check trips back here on the flop? And I want to give a couple notes on this spot as it applies to live poker because I do think there's some kind of interesting stuff to talk about. I'm going to move myself out of the way. I know you guys like to see my face, but the stats a little more important than seeing me. I'll wedge myself into this corner over here. So I guess let's just start off with how we're going to be playing trips. On the stack depth, you can see the pot says 200, just add a 0 to get the right amount. So 2,600. All right. So the question becomes first off, you know, what is our C-bet? Actually, taking a step back, not with my trips, but first question, should we have bets here? Obviously, we're in position, single raise pot, C-bet. I know it's very simple, but just we're going through our logic. Then what is our optimal size? Obviously, we know this board is solved down to 30% pot, so we're going to use 30% pot. And what is the board's frequency? As we can see here on the right, it is 76%, 76 whatever percent. So when percentages get this high into the 70s, everything's going to be mixing, as you can see here. Even some of our most frequent checks, hands like Queen 7, which gain the absolute least by betting. Still a good chunk of betting happening with those hands if you do not have the Queen of Spades. So everything's going to be a mix. And we begin to look for characteristics that move it towards either a lower frequency bet or higher frequency or a pure bet. I kind of want to hone in on the trips for a moment here because I think this is a pretty important aspect to playing poker in general, but also definitely in heads up. How often do I trap with my 3 of a kind? Now, what's kind of weird in this situation is if I'm playing online and I see that a hand bets the flop 98% of the time, I can always just randomize a couple percent in and checks. When you're playing live poker, it's a lot more difficult to do that. So the question becomes, how do I mix my checks in? And just a little tip that I would give you when it comes to playing this strategy, I would go ahead and mix in some of my worst trips checking back. So 4-3, 5-4. I'm going to be checking those back. And then, of course, I'm also going to be checking back hands like pocket kings. So maybe a little bit of king 4 as well. So in doing this, I know that your range is not balanced because you can't really have the middling trips when you check back. But I don't think there's a better way to do it when you're playing live poker. You kind of have to find your ways to round out your strategy. And then when you check back, if you want to turn some trips into a bluff, if things get particularly crazy, you have that option. And then, of course, you also do have your very strong value bets as well. So in this case, it'd be 4-3 off, 5-4 off. Going to be hands that we're checking back. Anyway, so the rest of the trips are all going to be pure betting. Looking for some characteristics of different hands that like betting or not betting. I do find it interesting that top kicker in this exact instance actually does like a very reasonable amount of checking back. I think on these paired boards, there's a little less value to be had going 3 streets when you do also have the king. But I think the other important aspect of this as well is that you block the ace X check calls, right? Because if we bet and we look at our opponent's counter, they have to continue with every ace. So, when we have the ace ourselves, we're definitely blocking a lot of that continue range. As for our pairs, all the pairs getting in there for quite a lot of betting. As we get lower, they bet more often. Something weird with deuces here where we actually bet a little bit less with deuces than you might think. But regardless, almost all the pairs getting in there. The pair we're betting least off is obviously queens, gains the least by betting. Nothing too crazy here. The ace highs, something kind of fun happening. As the ace high gets lower, you actually see more betting, particularly when you have an ace that is not the spade, right? Because we block some of the backdoor flush draw hands. A little less likely they have those floats they can check call. And we do see more checking happening with kings. So king X, lots of checking with our weak king X. And then, once we get down to like weak queen X, we're almost pure betting. Try and knock our opponent out of the pot, and we have plenty of value. Okay, I don't need to get too deep into the weeds on the C betting, although we probably already did. So baseline 76. Our pairs are going to end up being a little higher than that if they gain from betting. Our strongest pairs will be a little bit lower than that. Our weak hands will probably lean towards a little bit higher bet frequency. Our middling hands will do more checking. One thing I found pretty consistently, guys, is your second best high card hand. So in this case, your queen X on this board. The middling hands, so second highest high card, middling kickers, right? So in this spot, queen 8, queen 7. These just do tons and tons of checking on basically every solution I've looked at. High frequency, low frequency, they almost all do tons of checking. And I think that the logic is pretty simple when I have queen 8, queen 7 in these kinds of spots where I don't actually gain a lot by betting with these hands on the flop, because the hands I get to fold, if we look at the counter strategy, he folds queen 5, right? And mainly calls queen 6, but a little bit of folding. And then starting queen 7, he basically pure continues. So maybe a cool heuristic you can take away here is when you have a hand that is on the cusp of what your opponent would defend versus a bet, you tend to have a much lower frequency bet. As you get beneath that cusp, bet frequency tends to increase. So I don't know if you find that useful or not. I personally do. Something to think about in these situations to kind of understand your thresholds at which bet frequency will start to increase somewhat dramatically. Okay, so this is our flop C bet strategy. Over to Kevin with king 4. Actually, let's talk about our hand specifically, I guess. It's also interesting. Pure betting the flop. So pure bet in theory, I imagine I pure bet, especially with the backdoor flush draw in game. I do sometimes put my weaker trips into the check lines, but I don't do that with the backdoor flush draw ones or many of them at all, because it's such a high frequency flop. You don't really want to be checking much. Okay, so we bet. Over to Kevin here. I put in a 2.5x approximately check raise strategy or half pot check raise strategy. How does he play this with the king 4? King 4 mainly traps. So kind of an interesting spot overall to talk about the counter strategy. And this is one of the reasons why the small bet size, I think, ends up being a pretty good strategy, especially on boards like this. Besides the fact that it's optimal. I mean, look at the complexity of this counter from Kevin, right? Think about how often he needs to be check raising, which is 16%. Check raise frequency is much higher on paired boards overall. And he has to really well blend this together, right? He has to. So first off, what's he doing with his trips? So middling trips check raise more. Weak trips and Strong chips check raising a bit less. Plenty of bluffing going on. We see the bluffs around the paired card definitely all getting in there. These will make some nice runouts they can barrel on. Obviously a 6, a deuce, suits, things like that. Even 5-3 no suits getting in there. I guess the cool thing about 5-3 of spades, and you check raise that on this board, you unblock floats, so you get some nice barrels. I imagine if we go down the check raise line, and by the way, you really don't need to play bet 3-bet on paired flops, in my opinion. I would probably want to verify that with Fabian, but once raise ranges get this low, I think you can play pure call. And most paired boards it's just unnecessary to play bet 3-bet. But anyway, regardless, not really what I'm talking about. So let's just say this is like, you know, a 9 of spades or an 8 of spades, like a real bricky card in here. You can see 5-3 of spades still will elect to barrel even on a card like this. And if it goes call, and let's just put like a queen out there on the river, 5-3 of spades, if we just make proportional to weight, definitely going to be barreling off because you unblock a lot of the hands that you want to get your opponent to fold. So anyway, we're a bit off topic there with the check raise line. A couple other things to think about here when we're looking at flop check raise, even though this is the imposition segment. Some king X still getting in there, some king queen, some king jack getting into the mix on these check raises. We're check raising jack 10 a lot here, probably counterintuitive. All our 10-9s kind of like it. Just a lot of check raising going on with our connected hands on this kind of board because we do have a good chunk of 4X hands. As for Kevin's hand, king, diamonds, 4 spades. Going to be check raising here about half the time. A good rule of thumb, guys, when you have the really strong hands, raising half the time on these static boards probably going to be pretty good for you. Strong hands that are more vulnerable will lean a little more towards like 3/4 of the time, like 10-4, jack-4 kinds of hands. I am surprised to see ace-4 and queen-4 at this low of a check raise frequency. Like I'd be doing these at least a quarter or half in game. So I'm a bit surprised that number is so low. But you do need to keep some 4s in your check call range to be able to check raise later streets. Anyway, so Kevin does decide to call. And the turn is the 3 of clubs. The question now becomes, what is the optimal size for us to be barreling in position? And it is incredibly clear cut here. The solver really only uses the 2/3 pot size. So pretty on point with our turn barrels overall. If we pull up our notepad where we look at what our turn barrels like to do, they prefer 58% pot. So this is run for 2/3 pot, but almost certainly 58% pot will be preferred. Given that I use 2/3 pot in the sim, we're gonna continue with it. Or sorry, not in the sim, but in the hand. We are going to continue with the 2/3 pot analysis. So what happens here on the turn in position, you can see you never trap the turn here with trips. You just don't do it. It's there's too much value to be had from king X for you to be going for any kind of tricky turn check play. So definitely want to be using a high frequency turn barrel here with all of your trips, almost a pure barrel really. And we do see that kings primarily plays this as a turn check. I think this is kind of intuitive because when we think about pocket kings, think about how much value there is to be had here, right? If our opponent had a 4, he's probably check raising the flop. He will sometimes have 4s in his check call, but probably check raising the flop, or at least a lot of the time. And those hands are going to be willing to put in multiple bets on the river anyway, so there's not like a big loss for us there. All right, but does our opponent really have king X here anymore? And the answer is no. We blocked that pretty solidly. So, there's really not as much value to be had. Now, when you have these nutted hands, you do want to be barreling some of the time at least. And I think if you're ever in position and you're just unclear what the correct answer is for you to be doing, I think just mainly betting your strong hands is good. But there are examples, and this is a clear-cut one, where the solver will pick some hands that want to trap back and look to raise rivers. So let's just play the check line actually for a moment here before we get into some other stuff. So let's go say this goes check. Let's just put a relative brick